Welcome everyone to day 2 of our Shake Up the System conference. We had a fantastic discussion yesterday and delighted that you joined us today. In day 1, we discussed the different levels of change at the personal, social, community, political and wider systems levels. We talked about the enablers and barriers to achieving change at the scale and pace we need for net zero. As we noted yesterday, this conference will not be focusing on technological systems change, for example, how energy networks and systems need to adapt for renewables. Instead, we'll be looking at the social aspects of systems change, what we might call the social scaffolding that's needed to support a fair and just transition. And once again, whilst recognising that these issues have a clear international dimension, today we'll be focusing on the changes that we need to see in the UK. I'm Sharon Darcy, the Director of Sustainability First. For those of you that don't know us, we're a think tank and charity that develops practical solutions to improve environmental, social and economic well-being, with a particular focus on utilities like energy, water and communications. This conference builds on our Together for a Fair Climate Future programme that we've been working with National Grid on in the run-up to COP26. We'd like to thank National Grid for their support and continuing to carry this partnership with us forward by working together to substantively address these issues. Now, today is all about action. We'll be exploring how to implement meaningful change in society for a fair climate future. We want to focus on practical steps to get enduring change. And we want to learn from each other in terms of how to address some of the challenges around systems change. Crucially, how to identify the levers for change, the hot point issues, who the key decision makers are, and how to influence and support them and give them confidence to undertake the transformational shift that we need. This conference is clearly not an end. In many ways, it's a beginning. We'll share the outputs of the conference in a series of briefings, and these will help shape our work at Sustainability First and help build the collective momentum we need for transformative change. We hope that the conference findings will also be a valuable input into the work of the new Sustainable Futures Energy Forum that we're working with Ofgem, the energy regulator, to establish next year. So before we get going, a bit of housekeeping. To access all the conference information, you'll be able to see you'll need to log in, to the Sustainability First website. This is the same place where you access the link to join Zoom. There's a full downloadable participant information pack with all the guidance that you need. You'll also receive this over email. You'll find everything you need for each conference section on the page entitled Conference Agenda Session Materials. We're posting a link in the website chat now. As our agenda outlines, after Alice has fed back some of the main themes from yesterday, we'll have a panel discussion for which we'll stay in this main meeting room, followed by an interactive session in small breakout rooms. At 5:15, we'll be reconvening with a different link to announce the winners of our 2021 Sustainability First Art and Writing Prizes, which were this year on the theme of Together for a Fair Climate Future. We'd be delighted if you could join us. The entries this year have been really inspiring. Many stay with you long after you've seen them, a powerful tool for creating new visions for the future and for forging new social norms that we need for systems change. Feel free to put any questions for the Sustainability First team in the chat, or if you're having any technical problems, please get in touch with my colleague Janine, whose email and telephone number can be found in the participant information pack. The panel discussions from the conference will be recorded, and we hope to make them publicly available on our YouTube channel. We ask that you please keep your microphones on mute, and please be aware that videos and names of participants may be visible, especially if you ask a question. The interactive session in breakout rooms will not be recorded. There will be opportunities at the end of the panel to ask panellists questions. So either raise your hand by clicking the reactions button at the bottom of the screen, and the chair will invite you to unmute and ask your question. Or if you prefer, put a question in the chat box, which will be moderated by a member of the Sustainability First team. We really encourage you to tweet and post on social media using the hashtag #FairClimateFuture. We want to get the most out of today. We've got a really diverse group of stakeholders, including artists, policymakers, utility companies, and many others. We're really looking forward to learning from each other and having interdisciplinary conversations. However, please be conscious that everyone is joining with very different but equally important ideas and perspectives. We encourage the use of uncomplicated language and avoiding jargon. In this conference, we need a safe space where everyone feels welcome. So please be respectful of each other at all times, valuing each other's perspectives, and giving everybody the space to participate. We might not all agree on everything, but it's important we understand where each other are coming from. Thank you. So first, Alice is going to share a summary from our breakout groups, the themes from the conference that came up yesterday on the barriers and enablers to systems change. Alice.
Thanks, Sharon. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Sharon mentioned, the final session yesterday was looking at barriers and enablers of change, and participants shared examples of challenges or barriers that they've been trying to overcome in their own work, and groups discussed possible enablers for overcoming those and enablers for change. So what we've done is we've collated the ideas that we heard through this activity and the panel discussions yesterday, and we've grouped these into a few themes just to summarise some of the conversations and ideas raised, and we hope that this will be useful particularly for those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday. These are very high level, but in any documents that we share after the conference, we'd love to share some of the specific examples and case studies that people shared yesterday. So firstly, you'll see on the slide some of the challenges and barriers to societal and systems change that were shared by speakers and participants yesterday. Firstly, the complexity of mapping systems and the difficulty in making connections across silos or with different actors and parts of these complex systems. This complexity can also lead to a lack of clarity on roles and responsibilities, and sometimes it isn't always clear who should lead on what. For example, what's the role of different actors, e.g. government, business, local actors in a particular area. We heard some fantastic examples of projects yesterday, people enacting change through community food growing groups, citizens engagement initiatives, but often as a result of resource and funding constraints, groups can find it difficult to scale up to maximise impact, and this was a barrier identified. Lack of inclusion and diversity and an unequal distribution of power was a common barrier. Who has the levers to make decisions? Where is power held? And who is included at all levels of change, including representation within environmental and utility sectors? Another barrier was that some citizen and community engagement activities are being completed in a way that feels more tokenistic than meaningful, leaving communities feeling consultation fatigue or research fatigue, and feeling that they're not benefiting or seeing the outcomes of projects and how they relate to their own lives. Communication was another barrier, with a lack of clear and accessible messaging around key issues. And then finally, education. And it was raised how the system isn't preparing people for current and future challenges, including sustainability, social justice, climate change not being embedded across curriculums. So having identified some of these barriers, the next slide collates and summarises some of the enablers that were discussed during these discussions and raised by speakers and participants. And these include the ripple effect of personal action. So the actions that we take personally can have a ripple effect in our social networks, encouraging our peers to take actions too. But for wider societal and systems change, and to deal with the complexity that we just discussed in the previous slide, and to work across silos, it was recognised that coordination is an important enabler, including between personal, social and political action. And within this complexity, there is also a need to map decision makers to be able to challenge the balance of power for more inclusive approaches. We heard some fantastic examples yesterday of regional and local approaches, and these can help bring together complex issues in a way that's tangible and meaningful for communities. And we heard that place-based solutions can enable horizontal or cross-cutting approaches to dealing with complex issues. Access to funding and resourcing was identified as a common enabler, in particular in relation to local authorities, NGOs, and community groups. Identifying and building shared community and societal values can help make sense of complexity. Connecting with other people, networks, groups, organisations with common interests can help overcome those barriers of scaling up. Meaningful engagement for the long-term and enduring partnerships was also discussed as being really important. Engagement needs to be early, and conversations and co-production are crucial. It's also important that engagement is enduring over the long term, as issues won't be solved overnight. Understanding and measuring social and environmental impacts can also enable change. Social and environmental metrics can help, but it was also noted that it's important that sometimes putting a financial value on everything can have negative unintended consequences, and things like scenario planning can be more helpful. Which is also linked to the importance of qualitative data, storytelling, personal experiences, art and creativity, and these can make change fun, simple and attractive. And then finally, for a curriculum that empowers students and teachers to take action, a range of enabling actions were shared, from embedding issues across the current curriculum to teacher campaigns and connecting up with common interest groups to act as a collective voice for campaigning. So that was a very quick summary of some of the themes of barriers and enablers to change that came up yesterday. And I'll now hand back to Sharon for our first panel discussion.
Thank you very much, Alice. Systems change is often seen as so vast and so complex that it's put in the too difficult box. In this panel, we want to hear from people who really made change happen. So our panel includes activists, people working with communities, people reshaping policy, and disruptive businesses. They'll be sharing their experiences in terms of how they've overcome challenges and how they've built momentum for transformational change. Each of the panelists will introduce themselves and speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll move to a Q&A and a bit of a discussion between us. And then there'll be an opportunity for members of the audience and participants to ask questions. Please note that the session will be recorded. I'll then ask a few more questions at the end. So please get ready when people have spoken to put your electronic hands up. And my colleague Claire Davidson will be monitoring the chat box. So if there are lots of questions, Claire will make sure they're fed through. So welcome very much to our fantastic panel. I'm going to ask each member of the panel to introduce themselves and make their opening remarks. We're going to start with Dr. Jake Ainscough, and Jake is a Senior Research Associate at Lancaster Environmental Centre. Jake, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sharon. And yeah, thanks for having me here today. It's an honour to be here. Right, so I'm Jake Ainscough. I work at Lancaster University on a project called the Climate Citizens Project, which is basically aiming to improve public engagement around climate change. So hopefully moving away from this kind of tokenistic engagement that we've just heard about, potential risk, but also kind of the long, windy kind of consultation documents that only vested interest and policy nerds ever read, towards a kind of much more kind of deliberative approach to engagement that kind of gives everyone an opportunity to pitch in. So that's what we're trying to do. And I thought I'd start just with kind of mapping out where the public are on climate change. And this is necessarily a bit of a caricature, so do bear with me, but just kind of the snapshots of where the data's at the moment. Increasingly, people do say they're concerned about climate change. That's getting up to about 80%, but that's quite a different question from asking people, is it in your top 3 concerns? And if you ask the question that way, the data are less, I don't know if encouraging is the right word, that's a bit normative, but people have much more proximate concerns in their life. I think it got up to about 30% of people putting it in the top 3, but has declined since COVID has erupted onto the scenes for obvious reasons. So there is a level of concern. There is also a willingness to do things. People as individuals are looking to make changes, although they don't, the vibration on, do anything about that. I'll carry on.
You're okay, Jake. You're better when you're a bit further away from the mic,
Okay.
I think.
Let's do that.
Yeah.
So people to make changes, even the stuff that politicians don't think people want to do, like eating less meat, flying less. Generally, people are willing to have a look at changing those things about their lives. But A, not everyone's massively well informed about what the most effective changes are, and B, there's just a growing frustration that people haven't swallowed hook, line, and sinker the message that it is just an individual problem. People are increasingly frustrated about the lack of action from government, both on the kind of the big picture questions that people can't do anything about individually, but also the basic stuff like making transport much more cheap and affordable and accessible. So that leaves us in a bit of a bind because we do have a government that are firmly committed to doing the bare minimum, I think it's safe to say, and also kind of cocking up what they are doing, which is a slight caricature again, but if you look at things like the Green Homes Grant, that's just such a step backwards on where we need to be on climate change policy. So the work we're doing is looking at how can we use deliberative methods to overcome those two challenges, the challenge of bad policy design and the challenge of lack of effective, well thought out policy. To back up slightly, deliberation as an approach to public engagement has a few key characteristics. One, you're looking to speak to a representative sample of people. You don't just want to speak to the usual suspects. Two, you provide an opportunity for people to learn things kind of from people with technical expertise, and so people can combine those technical expertise with the sort of tacit knowledge that they have about, the way they live their lives. Third is allowing people to deliberate, to kind of form shared positions on things, and then fourth, some kind of mechanism to communicate that position to those in power, to policymakers. That's the kind of the basic tick list. The most prominent example of this has been Climate Assembly UK. So this was a specific deliberative exercise, brought around 100 people together to deliberate around climate policy. It was commissioned by some of the committees in Parliament, reported towards the end of last year. But we've seen deliberation in smaller instances, a lot of kind of citizens' juries and stuff being set up at local levels. And these things have been used more recently on climate policy, but on lots of different other policy areas previously. But as a project, what we're trying to do is say, how do we move away from these standalone assemblies and standalone juries, because they do have various issues with them, and how do we embed a kind of more deliberative approach to policymaking more generally? Because these things can be good as standalone things. They allow people to form educated positions on complex policy problems and transmit that to policymakers in a way that you can design policy that doesn't do things like set off protests like the Gilets jaunes, for example. But they have clear barriers. If you look, take the Gilets jaunes, for example, that motivated Macron to set up a climate assembly in France. He originally said he was going to transmit every recommendation that came out of that to the Parliament unfiltered, and he's backtracked massively. I think about 15% of the recommendations made it through unfiltered, some were just rejected, some heavily amended. So these processes themselves don't give people more power. If they're commissioned by policymakers can still just say no. So how do we move from just having these standalone things that can be cherry-picked from to a much more deliberative approach? And I'm probably taking up more than my 5 minutes, but just 3 quick things that we're sort of thinking about. One is just more widespread use. They do just have a functional role in improving policy design. So people like the Committee on Climate Change that we're working with could make much better use of them. 2, embed them in an institutional form that commands respect. If you look at the way that these bodies tend to have more impact overseas, for example, in Denmark, they are conducted and have been conducted for a long time by a body that's seen as legitimate and is deferred to by policymakers and has a voice in the policy process. And third, to think about deliberation in a much more systemic way. Are we good as a society at having informed discussions around climate change and communicating those messages to policymakers? And what can we do to improve that process if we're not? I'll leave it there because I'm probably over my 5 minutes, but that's what we're doing.
Brilliant, Jake. And those 3 points at the end, I think, are really important in terms of how you talk that really good engagement, turn that good engagement into action. Thank you. And we're now going to move to Polly Billington. Polly's Chief Exec of UK 100. Polly, over to you.
Thanks very much. UK 100 is a network of locally elected leaders who've made a commitment to act on climate, clean energy and clean air. So they are decision makers in a number of communities across the UK, different tiers of government, district councils, county councils, unitary authorities, London boroughs, metropolitan boroughs, combined authorities, directly elected mayors, including in some of the big city regions. So these are people who make decisions and have powers and resources every day, who can really make a difference to the systems that we're talking about, but also have limits to their powers. And I think it's important to understand, in terms of the processes that we're talking about and shaping up the system, understanding how the system works, and therefore that's the only way you can actually work out how to change it. I think what's really interesting about so a number of our local authorities, for example, have conducted some forms of deliberative engagement and deliberative citizens' assemblies and engagement as part of their response to declaring a climate emergency. Some of them have been more successful than others. Some of them have been adopting those recommendations in different formats. I will push back a little bit on the way that Jake has suggested that all of those deliberative processes are no good if they're commissioned by policymakers. Ultimately, decision makers are the ones who make the decisions. Unless and until those processes have got recognition from those policymakers, and they value the process themselves, then obviously they're going to have there's little purpose in engaging in them. And quite often these are seen, and I've been involved in these kind of things for far too long. I have seen these kind of processes being used in order to demonstrate engagement without actually really co-designing solutions. I think what's been really interesting about the Climate Assembly was commissioned by Parliament, right? It wasn't commissioned by government, it was commissioned by Parliament. It's important to understand that Parliament, it has some decision-making powers, but it's not the same as the government. And therefore its response to that Climate Assembly is going to be different from the one that you're going to get from ministers. But I think what was interesting is when we were talking about this earlier in the week, I'd gone to one of the events about the Climate Assembly, and I had noticed that there weren't any MPs there, and I was really worried. I thought the MPs hadn't taken it seriously. I spoke to the people who arranged the Climate Assembly literally last night, and she went, "Oh yeah, no, we didn't invite them to the party. We had one-to-ones with them during the day." I said, that's somebody who understands power, because this is the most important thing. You can only build public consent and support, and some of the things that Hugo will talk about, Clem will talk about, Samia will talk about, and Jake has already talked about, is building up that public consent and support so that it's much easier for politicians and decision makers to do the right thing. But it also is important that when you are building that public consent and support, not only do you mobilize people, but you give them an understanding about what, where and how they need to target their focus. And that's about understanding decision makers and their motivations. If you really want to shift the dial, I recommend that campaigners behave less like Brits abroad and shouting simply louder, and instead choose to learn the language of the decision makers, because that's where you're much more likely to be able to get some progress. And the example of Involve, who worked on the Climate Assembly, making sure that there were one-to-one meetings with MPs. It's much harder for MPs to get away. They feel very flattered that they're having one conversation. They don't just turn up to a room with some warm white wine, chat amongst themselves and say, yes, I attended the Citizens Assembly party. They have to actually make some decisions. So it's a really important use of time. But it's also about walking around in their shoes. If you're a local leader, one of ours, for example, who's elected, they are responsible statutorily for looking after vulnerable children and adults. They also have to collect the bins or process the waste. They are responsible for planning policy and transport policy, keeping the lights on in your street, making sure that there are enough school places for children and so forth. Now, there'll be different powers at different levels, but imagine if you've got all of that, then a pandemic comes along after 10 years of not having that much cash, and somebody says, you've got a climate emergency and I want to see immediately what you're going to do about it. They will declare it, but acting rapidly in that kind of situation, one person described to me, making decisions when you're in government is like standing in a wind tunnel with pieces of paper flying past you, and if you're lucky you manage to catch some. Now obviously most people try to be more strategic than that, but sometimes the managing of crises can make it really hard. So it's important to make sure that when we are looking at trying to tackle the climate crisis, we're tackling other problems that people have right now. And this is about mainstreaming our messaging, because the mainstream and the most vulnerable are the ones who are going to have other things to think about apart from the climate crisis. And as Jake has pointed out, and as others will point out, there's the awareness and concern about climate change has never been higher. But people will still want to make sure that they have got jobs to go to, homes that they can run and afford to keep warm and cool in summer, that their kids have got are safe to walk to school, are going to get a good education and a good job, and you're going to have good health. Those are the kind of motivations that will not only motivate the mainstream and the most vulnerable, but therefore your elected leaders who have got so many other things to think about. So analyze the powers that they've got. I can share in the chat the power shift report that we've done, which is a comprehensive analysis of all the powers that local authorities have got that can be used to on net zero, the limits of those powers and how you can use them. The limits quite often go to the fact that nationally we need to change the rules, and understanding what those rules are, who has the power to change them, and what we need to do to be able to make sure that those things are properly enforced is really important. Because ultimately you can have all of the placards and protests you like, unless you're able to transform that into political will. I think this conference is really, really exciting, but I would remind you that politics is alchemy, not chemistry. There is not a formula for saying we can do this and therefore these people will do this. It's about understanding moments in time, people, messages, moods. There's so much that is involved, and if we can do that, you actually can have some systems change. But I would leave with one message: always maintain your vigilance. Simply because you've achieved a change doesn't mean it's in the bricks forever. It can slip back at any moment. So understand how you're going to enforce the laws you manage to change, and how you're going to get people not just to do something once, but for it to become a habit. If I can leave on that note, perhaps we can we'll have a good conversation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Polly. And I think you've given us some really good insights there into how power works, and needing to understand power works and needing to meet people where they are with their day-to-day issues in their wider lives. And we're now going to move to Samia Dumbuya. Samia is a climate activist. Samia, over to you.
Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is well today. And yeah, thank you so much, Polly, for everything you've just said. This is something that I've learned through my activist journey, like the power of power mapping and picking the right moments to spread our messages in the climate justice movement. But before I get there, I want to talk about my journey into activism. So I was born and raised in East London. I grew up, like majority of my adolescence, in between the Tate and Lyle Sugar Factory and London City Airport in Newham Council. And I just remember like looking around thinking, this is not normal in terms of the air pollution that came from those industries. And I remember thinking, oh, is no one going to speak about this? I'll raise this up with my cousins and friends who lived in my neighborhood. And I remember like everyone saying, oh, it's not that serious. It's not that deep. Like, why do we need to talk about these things? And I pointed out to them like, oh, this definitely has an impact on our health, because I've definitely seen younger people get early asthma. I see lots of people getting their conditions exacerbated by pollution. But I remember at the time, I didn't really have the science or the education to really back me up. So I felt like I was screaming in a silo about an issue that many people should care about. And then I joined a few youth programs where I met people like me, and we started a coalition called Our Air, Our Health. And we lobbied the Tower Hamlets Council to introduce some policies in place just for them to take action to mitigate air pollution in Tower Hamlets. And we came through the lens of, hey, we're young people of color. We are situated in neighborhoods where there's high levels of emissions that are causing detrimental effects on not just our personal health, but our family's health, our community health. And again, I remember at that time, no one was really picking up that messaging. And I remember when I was like going around to people say like, how can I make air pollution enticing for the press? Like, how do we make something that people can't physically see right on their front of their newspapers and their news outlets that they look at every day? And then people just said, you have to pick the right moment, you have to pick the right moment. And I remember we collaborated with other groups where you had mum groups where they noticed that their young kids were developing respiratory issues. And then that was it. Like, that's when the movement started to boom, where mums got involved. And I guess people care about babies a lot. So it was just like, let's push that image of like babies being affected by air pollution and young people in nurseries being affected by air pollution. And that's when we started to see a momentum going on in different councils and even in mainstream national newspapers where air pollution started being taken seriously all of a sudden. But at that journey, I felt like this was not enough. So in my journey, I just kept on escalating and escalating. I joined the Young Friends of the European movement, where I wanted to connect with other young climate activists across different regions, just to see what's happening in their countries and what's worked, what hasn't worked. And I remember just being a part of a community, and it's because of being part of that community on a European level, it sustained my fight for environmental justice. FYI, when I say climate justice or environmental justice, I basically intersect environmental issues with social issues, because I don't think those things are separate from each other. And I think that was one of the frustrations I had early in the movement, where people kept everything environmental, but they didn't link it to the effect it had on people's social mobility, their mental health, and other social issues that we see across the UK. And yeah, so me and my friends started Seize the Vote, which is basically about empowering young people of color to not just create change in their communities, but to understand how change happens on a political sphere. So what Polly just mentioned, where you can have your placards, you can have your messages everywhere and scream and shout, but at the end of the day, if you don't know how the system works, then you can't create impact or influence change in decision-making spaces. So right now we're currently in a project where we're building tools and resources that can be replicable and shareable to young people who want to create change. Because I see so many campaigns where people target Boris Johnson, but it's like, oh, but this issue that you picked in your local community concerns your local authorities. Don't go straight up to Boris Johnson, like target the people that actually have the influence in decision-making in your own areas. And yeah, with shaping a fairer future for climate change within our movement, I think my top 3 things is don't try and reinvent the wheel, find what's already happening in your community. Because we always feel like, oh, I'm the only one who thinks about this. And it's like, that's not the case. I can assure you there are a handful of people, groups, organizations in your area that's already doing the work. What they need is more manpower and amplification. And since we talk a lot about sustainability, it doesn't make sense to keep these skills and knowledge to ourselves. We need to pass this on to younger generations and make sure that we equip them with the tools to continue the work that we're doing. And also, lastly, just democratizing activism. So making sure that there's an intergenerational effort with fighting against the climate crisis, because lots of people seem to think, oh yeah, like let's just rely on people like Greta Thunberg and like look at the youth climate activists and just leave everything on their shoulders. Like we need to make sure our activist spaces are intergenerational and intercultural as well, and making sure people understand how they can access power. And that's me.
Brilliant, Samia. That's really inspiring, and some really good summary actions there, I think, that are really applicable elsewhere. We're now going to move to Clem Cowton. Clem is Director of External Affairs at Octopus Energy. Thanks, Clem.
Thanks. And actually, before I start, I want to pick up on a couple of things that both Samia and Polly have said, because I think so I've only been kind of campaigning on green things for 10 years. But actually, even in the time that I have been doing this job, it is really, really noted. I used to go into meetings with politicians and talk about, you know, jobs, growth, business, anything except climate change, even though I was representing businesses that had the solutions to climate change, renewable energy and clean technology, because it was considered a bit sort of naff and passé, and you know, you wouldn't be, you know, if you mentioned climate change, that, you know, you're a bit worried that you might sound a bit non-serious and like some, you know, like a sort of sandal wearing hippie, and you lose the legitimacy of the case that you are making. And now it's the first thing, you know, and it's worth noting that that entire 10 years has been under a Conservative government, and you now get, you know, well, for a start, the Prime Minister in America today talking a very serious game on climate, but also politicians throughout this government and throughout the opposition who might have previously been embarrassed talking about climate, talking about, you know, putting it front and center of what they're saying, and with the kind of jobs and growth message almost being a secondary you know, secondary message. So we've got, you know, it's due to campaigners like Samia, like Polly, and actually, you know, like Extinction Rebellion. I know that there's been a lot of criticism of their methods, but it's not, that's, you know, that I noticed, you know, in the conversations I was having with business and politicians that summer, you know, a couple of years ago, after they took over Oxford Circus, even that was, you know, achieved a kind of step change in the narrative. So I couldn't agree more. I talk a bit, I'm sorry for my diversion there. I'm Clem Cowton, I'm a Director of External Affairs at Octopus Energy. Octopus actually was created with a dual mission, which was to tackle climate change, but also to make energy more transparent, fairer, and more affordable for people. And to do that through digital technology. I think historically, the idea of, you know, of green and cheap had been seen in a kind of constant tension with each other. The idea is that doing something that is, you know, good for the planet is necessarily going to be bad for people's wallets. And actually, there is no reason why that should be the case. What we've spotted is that with digital technology, really, you know, obsessive focus on people, on customers in our case, or citizens, you know, in political parlance, it is possible to both drive down the cost of energy and decarbonize. And you've got to remember as well that energy is the thing that sits underneath absolutely every activity that we do as a species. And so if you can decarbonize energy, you can solve climate change. I think the kind of, you know, I don't want to get into sort of theories of change, not least because I'm not very equipped to speak about them. But the observation that we had setting up Octopus was that if you look at the sectors where, in order to achieve net zero both in the UK and globally, you have to achieve transformative systemic change. Involving every single person on this planet in a very short space of time, you know, 10 to 20 years ideally. And if you kind of look in recent history, the only kind of times or sectors or industries where that has happened is in things like, for example, Amazon with their complete transformation of the retail of the kind of retail environment, or with the iPhone and how that has completely shaken up how we communicate, live our lives, call a cab. You know, you know, anybody queuing up for the first iPhone would have had no idea that in a minute taxi drivers should be looking over their shoulder. These transformative changes have happened because they have included customers and consumers. So they've created kind of mass consumerization of this product. They've made it affordable, desirable, tangible, intuitive for people who have then grasped that opportunity and run with it. So rather than a kind of top-down mandated change, although by the way that does enable these business models, the kind of mechanism by which you can corral large populations globally across multiple economies, across different cultures and conditions, is by putting the kind of power directly in their hands and in their pockets. You know, there are two ways that people can enact change. That one is by voting in the ballot box, and the other is by voting with their wallets. And Octopus Energy exists to enable that voting with your wallets to achieve systemic change. How have we done that? Well, our technology platform is called Kraken, and it enables people to it sets up the kind of digital environment that you need in order to firstly be able to serve customers at a low cost and do so with a very high quality, so that people feel looked after and engaged in their energy. But secondly, and almost most importantly, it enables the flipping of the energy system that we are about to see, where you go from a centralized hydrocarbon intensive system, you flip that to something that's decentralized, involving lots and lots of micro generation and decentralized generation, and requires therefore to manage demand to match the output of wind farms and solar farms, and it enables that to happen. So with, for example, things like our Agile tariff or our Go tariff, we enable people to be paid to charge their electric vehicle at times when there's lots of wind on the grid. We have a special electric vehicle tariff that means that you can charge your electric vehicle charging. It's called the electric juice network. That you can charge your electric vehicle at, I think it's 200,000. No, that can't be right. 20,000, let's say, charging points across Europe. Numbers aren't my specialty. And charge that back to your bill at home, so you can use your card to charge an electric vehicle. You can get cheaper. We have a tariff called our fan club, where people who live close to a wind farm can get cheaper energy at times when the wind turbines are turning very fast. You can look out your window, see that the wind is blowing see that there's a strong wind speeds, and know that any energy that you use at that point will be cheaper at that time of day. So enabling this in this environment where the cheapest electron is the greenest electron that's traveled the shortest distance down the emptiest wire, i.e. using our renewable energy resource to the maximum efficiency by using it at times of day when there's lots of it, and using it when it's the most local to us. And our kind of next phase is to completely revolutionize how we heat our homes by slashing the cost of the heat pump, so that we can shift very quickly away from burning gas in our homes for central heating. It's very relevant this week. I've spent quite a lot this week talking to the media about the gas price spikes that are happening around the world at the moment, particularly in the UK, and it's really exposed how vulnerable we are to global commodities, that kind of very expensive fossil gas. If we can get off our off our gas-powered heating and move on to heat pumps, we can massively reduce bills, but also reduce our exposure to this, very frightening geopolitical scene that's playing out globally. I think I've probably gone way over my time, so I'm going to shut up. But thank you very much for having me.
Thanks very much, Clem. And I think there's a lot of food for thought there in terms of how disruptive businesses like Octopus can help achieve wider environmental goals. Now we've got our last speaker, last but not least, Hugo Tagholm. Thank you very much for joining us, Hugo, who's the Chief Exec of Surfers Against Sewage.
Look, thanks very much for having me here today, and pleased to follow on last, although so many points that have been raised so far that I'm sort of dying to start the debate. I'm sort of not completely convinced that Amazon's an amazing example of systems change, of taking away the money from the high street and accumulating it to send one man to outer space. But anyway, we'll come back to that maybe. But I run a small campaigning charity called Surfers Against Sewage. Somewhat of a misnomer these days. We're more than just surfers, and certainly more than just sewage. But we were started back in 1990 when there was a real issue with raw sewage being pumped out right around the country into some of our best loved beaches, into the ocean that people were enjoying, and a small group of surfers rose up to challenge that, and challenge the water companies, and challenge politicians of the time. Thankfully, that came along at the same time as some really powerful European legislation, really specifically the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive as part of that helped create the level playing field and force water companies to invest in treating that sewage effluent and making sure that it didn't pollute the coastline as it was back then. And the next sort of 10, 15 years were spent on the investments that put that right. The water companies invested billions of pounds, which was good, and has led to some good change. Some of that because of people power with Surfers Against Sewage and other great campaigning groups, Friends of the Earth, who we've had already mentioned today. People rising up and talking about what they saw at the front line. And to Samia's point, that's really important. Not to be disempowered because you haven't necessarily got the science degree or the education behind you, but you're saying it as you see it in front of you. And people really were getting ill. People really were seeing very polluted beaches, and people rose up to challenge that. And I see now we're in a new decade, new era, which is very similar to the 1990s, an era when people were rising up back then in the 1990s, not just against sewage, but against bypasses being built, new roads being built, against the poll tax, lots of different things that people were unhappy about. And we're seeing the same sort of texture now. But to Polly's point, change doesn't necessarily last unless you're very, very vigilant. And sadly, we're now seeing the return of the spectre of sewage pollution. Last year alone, 3.1 million hours into our rivers around the UK. That's why we've only got 14% that meet good environmental status, none that meet good environmental and good chemical status. We've got a regulator that's been defunded for many, many years, so cannot hold the farming industry nor the water industry to account. So we've got our work cut out again. So it's round two. We've come through this first phase, the first wave of sewage pollution successfully with systems change, people power coming together with industry and government in the end to force change. But now we're in the second wave. But as an organization, we've diversified. We're now one of the country's sort of best known marine conservation charities, working on much more than just sewage. So we work on plastic pollution, where we've sort of had lots of action since 2017, the Blue Planet Effect, which Sharon mentioned earlier, which has been good. We've brought together millions of people. We have a model that empowers local leaders, empowers volunteers, and equips them with the sort of tools to do citizen science and find the facts in their backyard, to challenge government and industry, to engage with consultations that are going on, and try and create change. We empower young people through our education program, not because we want them to lead in the future, but because we want them to challenge our leaders now. So we give them the tools to disrupt, talk to government, talk to parliament, talk to business leaders, because I think, as I saw in the chat group, actually there are people now who can make the choices to create the change we need to see in systems. We can't really wait for another generation to come along to have the big decision making, and it's unfair to put it on their shoulders for the future. And so we've done a lot on plastic pollution, but as we may come to shortly, we've worked on deposit return systems, on the plastic bag charge, on the recycled plastics tax, on bans on straws and stirrers. But the pace of change is still too slow. We're not seeing the implementation happen fast enough. And I think that's something that's becoming very, very dispiriting to the grassroots, to the campaigners on the ground, because we really are in an era that needs more action. So just to sort of to finish, and there's many points I'd love to sort of come back to in the discussion, but we're really connecting three sort of bits of action. We're empowering those people on the ground at the beachfront, but not exclusively at the beachfront, right around the country. We give them the tools to find the evidence, to have the conversations with the decision makers, whether it's in government or in industry or elsewhere, sometimes in the media. And we project their voice through Parliament with, we work on an all-party parliamentary group, the Ocean Conservation, APPG, bringing together many cross-party MPs and other leaders and experts from different sectors, which is the sort of start of the political journey for many of our campaigns, which then rolls into the sort of formal processes, as it were. I'm going to stop there because I'm conscious of time and keen to have a discussion.
Brilliant. A really inspiring set of comments there. Thank you very much, Hugo. Before we open up to the floor, and please do start thinking of your questions and put your hands up. It's the reactions button at the bottom of the screen where there's a raise your hand icon. I'd like to ask a question that somebody's put in the chat, which is really building on this theme about the pace of change, picking your moments, and how if you start from where people are, so with the current concerns and issues you have, that might lead to change which is too slow. So Hugo ended by saying, you know, we're in the decisive decade, we've got some real challenges that we need to meet at pace. What do panelists think in terms of getting this balance right between not scaring the horses, so not frightening people about the changes we need to see, being able to relate to them where they are at the moment, but getting change at scale, getting that noisy campaign? The question was really, is there still a role for noisy campaign groups to try and up the ante? Who'd like to come in on that? Hugo and Clem are clapping there. Polly, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, I would say the thing is, we have to start immediately. Absolutely, the science is. I have a slide that I use when I do use slides, right? Which is an arrow in one direction, which is the laws of science, and then another one, the arrows of the arrow which is the laws of politics, and it's a bit like an irresistible force meeting an immovable object, because they're not really designed. Politics is not really designed to deal with science in the way that we need to, but that's all we've got, right? So you have to harness the laws of politics in order to be able to meet the science. And one of the reasons why then it's not very well suitable, because politics is all about negotiation. You literally can't negotiate with physics, right? Unless, I mean, maybe Einstein can, but I know I can't, right? And we've got this existential threat. So dealing with politicians who'll go, okay, like, let's split the difference. And you go, no, splitting the difference and you still get runaway climate change. They're like, well, what do you want me to do? The key thing is acknowledging that there are actually other laws which are ones that work for politicians and for the public that can help. I remember seeing one cartoon when they went, oh, so it's going to completely screw our economy, right? Which for climate people are like, no, we've been going on about it screwing the planet for ages. Why are you now worrying because it's the economy? It's like, because they understand the economy, right? You know why? Because the economy is about whether you keep your house, you keep your job, and your kids are okay. Now, we know that the planet is also about keeping your job, keeping your house, and keeping your kids okay, but the economy is closer. It happens now. So that's why this goes to some of the points that Clem and others were making about jobs and growth and health and well-being. So yes, it will require investment now. And if you want to do it fast and you want to do it fair, it is going to cost now. The point is, it's going to cost a hell of a lot less doing it now than leaving it till later. And that is ultimately the trade-off that we've got to make. And bearing in mind, within my political lifetime, I'm 123, so don't worry about that. But literally within the last 15 years, we've had two massive economic crises, global financial crash, and now the pandemic. The government on both times were not short of injecting money into the economy to stop it from falling over. Note to decision makers, why don't you do it again? And this time, it won't be just about avoiding a catastrophe. It's about reshaping our economy in a way that we can all benefit from. Breathe cleaner air, have better jobs, be able to afford to keep your house warm and cool. Those kind of things are definite benefits that people will feel motivated by. So I would say, yes, there's obviously always a place for the protesters. The reason why I can say that is because I worked in the department when the placards were being waved outside, and I know it makes a difference if you've got political will on the inside. If you haven't, You might as well be for the birds, because all they're going to do is say, that's just getting in the way of me going in and out of the office.
Great, thanks, Polly. Hugo and then Jake. You're on mute, Hugo.
I agree with Polly there. I mean, sometimes I think probably SS acts like Brits abroad and does a bit of shouting, but we're very connected with lots of politicians too. So a foot in both camps. But look, to this point of jobs and sort of pace of change, I think we've seen with COVID this sort of a dress rehearsal for what might need to happen now in terms of some of the changes that need to happen environmentally, and with jobs and potential retooling and reshaping of the economy. Politicians seem to have bypassed all consultations. They seem to have bypassed all of the length of time it takes to make any other decision to enforce on us as individuals different rules and regulations during the last 2 years, and that's been for good reason, and it's hopefully helped save many lives. But I think they're not acting with the same sort of determination and sort of pace that they need to on the environmental issues. And to Polly's point, I think many of these decisions around the economy, the optic is the wrong way around with the climate crisis. Actually, this is an opportunity for us to do things much better, and on a very small scale on what we've worked on deposit returns. Just a very tiny thing, which can have positive carbon savings, also create green jobs, create domestic recycling industry. They're still dragging their feet on implementing that. That might come in halfway through this environmental decade, this decade of ecosystem restoration. I mean, that's not fast enough. That's on one thing. We've got many things. We should be seizing the low-hanging fruit and telling people that we are creating jobs, that we're investing in those jobs, and it's about their jobs for the future and the jobs for their children.
Thanks very much, Hugo. Jake.
I think Clem was coming in before me, but I could be wrong. Were you?
There's something very strange. Oh, it's fine. No, go ahead. I don't mind coming in later.
Oh, 1 second. I'll work out to put the hand down later. I don't think different things, but the one I'm going to come to is I'm very nervous about the narrative of speed and the decade of change and these types of things, and there's a number of reasons for it. One is we're with the best will in the world not going to do it, and the second part of that is that you don't need to be a what about China person to realize the UK is a drop in the ocean here on the mitigation point. It's just true. It's just, I think it's a kind of inbuilt Eurocentrism that we all have, that we're still convinced that the West is kind of going to be the one that responds to this, and it's just not the case anymore. So I think that there's an issue with that narrative, and I think the bit missing from this conversation is the adaptation point. How are we going to react to the extreme weather events? How are we going to the ways that climate is going to manifest itself are the things that are going to evoke the political responses, I think, and they are the things that we should probably be thinking about much more than we are at the moment. So yeah, it's just, sorry, I'm sort of wrestling here between my kind of activist hat and my academic hat, but I'll stay in the Lancaster camp for now, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Jake. Clem.
What I wanted to say was, I think part of the answer here is that we need to get away from this idea that green is expensive. Increasingly, the economies that don't switch to renewable power are going to be the economies that failed to industrialize in the last global economic shift. So I don't think at the beginning of the transition, we needed government money to kickstart innovation and to address, to try to level the playing field between the kind of hydrocarbon, context that would, the incumbency that we had. We are approaching, if not actually past, tipping point there. So, renewable energy is already cheaper than fossil fueled energy, and more and more of the the kind of trillions of dollars of global investment is pivoting towards the next big thing, the innovation, the business model, the investment that will, you know, that will be the thing that is sustainable and wins people big. So, like, you know, the kind of the money has now kind of changed tack to back the global, and actually speaking to Jake's point there, what's very heartening about that is that markets are global, technology is global, innovation is global, and to an extent consumers are global. So, you know, once you've solved a technology problem in one country, that is then exportable and replicable in other countries. So it's not just about persuading the politicians, it's also about coming up with solutions and proving models. And that, you know, and actually Octopus we're a great example of that. We started off in the UK just doing power here. We're now in 11 countries, including Australia and Japan. You know, and Japan is one of the countries that is, you know, we are helping to pivot their economy by doing all the things we've been doing here. So, though, you know, I wouldn't lose hope. I don't think we need to kind of get too worried about what the kind of, you know, what the headline pound sign is in terms of politicians' investment of taxpayers' money into solutions. Obviously, that's always helpful. There's not a totally linear relationship there. You can achieve very disruptive systemic change on the cheap, as it were.
And just coming back on that, Clem, we've had a question in the chat about the social impact of transformational change when you look at companies like Amazon. So clearly, you know, many people love Amazon and rely on its services, but there are some really significant social concerns. So have you got any views in terms of how a disruptive business needs to balance both delivering on those environmental goals and really facing up to the social impacts it might be having?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, I use Amazon as an example of transformative change, not necessarily as a ethical business model that we should be looking to ape. What's interesting about Amazon is that they put the customer before everything else, and that is something that has been missing often in green business and in technology. But you're absolutely right. You know, it's really important that the kind of paradigm that we shift to is one that also starts to tackle some of the kind of fundamental inequalities of the fossil fuel age, and that's a really important part of it. Yes.
Thanks, Clem. Jake, and then we've got a question from Suzanne Price. It would be good, Suzanne, in a moment if you wouldn't mind asking your question yourself. Jake, do you want to come in first, though? Or was that an old hand?
No, it sort of wasn't. I don't know if it might make sense to answer that question first, but it's just to push back slightly on the kind of, certainly the reorientation of global finance. And I think the cost bit comes into this, but the fact is that most of the way the indices are set up, such as that finance is being reoriented, they're insufficient, but mainly they're insufficient because gas is still seen as a transition fuel. And I think it's hard to get past that, not only because it's a problem in its own right, but it locks you in, and the lock-in bit is where the pricing comes in. Yes, okay, pound for pound, wind might be cheaper at this point, but you've got the infrastructure, you've got that sunk cost. Pulling existing infrastructure out of generation is where those costs massively ramp up. If you look at all the CCC's models, they sort of assume no wastage, they assume everything gets to live out its life. All the infrastructure we have gets to live out. And the IEA at the international level have similar assumptions with their models. So you've got money at the moment going into new gas, which is a problem in its own right, but it's also a problem because it's going to be really expensive if you want to turn it off later down the line. So you've got to look at those kind of sunk costs in the infrastructure rather than just the sort of point price.
Thank you. Let's move to Suzanne. Suzanne, are you happy to ask your own question?
Yes, that's fine, thank you. So I did some research into the young people in Bristol who are organising the Green New Deal push, but that's a political organisation, or it would involve political parties. How would that fit in? I mean, that's very holistic and it looks at all aspects of society like energy and different things. How would that fit in though in terms of voting? And Polly, are you saying that it's better that we go through tapping into, as you say, what I think it was you who said, what people relate to and their motivations? That makes sense.
I think so. I know there's a lot of campaigning around the Green New Deal. I know, for example, there are 9 resolutions going to Labour Party conference with Green New Deal in them in some way, shape or form. So it's in some ways it's a bit of an umbrella for people to include in them what they want to see in terms of climate change transformation. So it has some advantages, but it has some disadvantages in that it can be whatever you want it to be. But at the same time, for a lot of people, the language itself has now become a political position, and therefore you're less likely, to be honest, to get the adoption of the measures that you put inside a Green New Deal from people who are making decisions who have said, oh yeah, no, that's a load of old lefty nonsense. I mean, I'm just being frank with you here, right? So it's like, what are the measures you want, right? And are they absolutely the right measures to achieve what you want to achieve? And are you wrapping it in the right way to get it accepted by the people who are trying to do it? Now, some of the things will literally not be acceptable in any way, shape or form to a Conservative government. I think there's quite a lot, and some of them are about common ownership or public ownership and nationalisation and things like that, where they're just going to go, well, we're not going to do that, right? So if that is absolutely yours without question, non-negotiable point, you're going to have a problem. If it is something else, right, which actually, if you didn't call it Green New Deal, they might go, oh, that's quite interesting. You might get further. Now, I know that there are loads of people who are doing amazing stuff within the frame of Green New Deal. I also know there is lots of stuff that is really amazing that needs to happen that is not badged as Green New Deal. So I wouldn't get hung up on a particular banner unless the banner is working for you with the people that you're trying to achieve things for. An example I will give, and I gave it a little bit in the chat about the Climate Change Act, right? And it goes to Clem's point, right? This was 15 years ago almost when they started working on this. And climate change, I remember, because I was a journalist then, I literally remember in the BBC, I did some stuff on it, and they said, oh yeah, no, we did climate change last year. It was just to be done last year. I went, well, you know, we have got some flood problems in east of England, and we're losing bits of the coastline, and people are going to lose their homes. I think it's a bit of a story. But when people put together that Climate Change Act, what they realized is that this bottom-up thing was just spinning in the mud. And what they needed was some top-down targets that was absolutely legislatively obliged to do. And that's a big ask for politicians to get to. So it's really interesting hearing the stories of those people who are involved in that process, because they didn't get hung up on language which wasn't going to work for the people that were involved, and they didn't get hung up on which party they were that were supporting them. They just lobbied and lobbied and lobbied on making the case for how this was going to be transformative and meet the objectives. Also remember, and sometimes this can actually work in our favor, if you get politicians will be happy to commit to targets that are not going to be within their own electoral time frame, right? It's one of the reasons why we've got a 20% renewables target in 2020, because Tony Blair committed to it in the early noughties. Well, he knew he wasn't going to be prime minister by then. The civil servants had to deliver that, and actually quite a lot of them were going to go, no, not me, it's impossible. It required further political will to say, Tony said that, I'm going to make it happen regardless. And that actually was across political differences within parties and governments, and across political parties, including the coalition and under David Cameron. We do not have an offshore wind industry by accident, by magic. It was long-term determination.
Okay, thank you very much, Susan, for your question, and Polly for that answer and the reminder about realpolitik. I think we're due to break for a comfort break now, but I wondered if the panelists would mind giving us one last takeaway message in one sentence, really succinctly, of this business about how we can get action. So how do we turn all the talk into action for a fair carbon transition, and in terms of the systems change? Clem, would you like to go first? One sentence, Clem.
We make it affordable, intuitive, easy and desirable for people to do it themselves.
Thank you. Hugo. You're on mute, Hugo.
Despite what Jake believes, I think make it faster, start making decisions faster.
Jake?
I think my takeaway is that if people don't want it, it's not going to happen. There's too much activism that's focused on what a clique of people want. There needs to be more attention to what I guess the wider electorate, for want of a better term, want, and focusing our attention on shifting that.
Brilliant, thank you. Samia?
Stop staying in your silos, amplify other people's work, make sure the work is interdisciplinary, like make sure that everything is, just move as a collective, basically. Stop thinking you're the only saviors in this fight.
Brilliant, thank you. Polly?
I think I've probably said enough, to be honest.
So maybe to know when to stop as well. Thank you all for being such a brilliant panel. It's been a really good discussion. You've given some really good insights there in terms of how to turn talk into action and to think about implementation. We've got a 10-minute comfort break now, so we'll be reconvening at 20 past, so it's just under 10 minutes now. Please do stay with us. We've got a really exciting interactive breakout group exercise after the break, which builds on the discussion that we've been having. So really tries to explore how to put some of those takeaway recommendations and ideas into action. So grab a cup of tea and we'll reconvene at 3:20. Thank you.